The radio crackled with static, then silence. Command tried again. Bravo 7, report your position. Nothing. In the operations center at Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan, faces turned grave. Somewhere in the Helmand Province desert, 8 Navy SEALs had vanished into a sandstorm that meteorologists were calling a 100-year event. The kind of storm that turned day into night, erased GPS signals, and swallowed entire convoys without a trace. Major Kavitha Raven Nakamura sat in the corner of the briefing room, her flight suit pristine, her posture relaxed. Too relaxed for the taste of Colonel Briggs, who'd been running helicopter operations in this godforsaken theater for 18 months. "We need every bird in the air," he announced, his voice cutting through the tension. "Apache gunships, Black Hawks, even the damn cargo haulers. These boys are running out of time." The room buzzed with activity. Pilots checked their gear, crew chiefs prepped aircraft, and intelligence officers spread maps across tables like tarot cards predicting doom. But Colonel Briggs's eyes kept drifting to Nakamura. She was the anomaly in his perfectly ordered military machine, a former Air Force pilot who'd somehow ended up flying Army helicopters after a career change nobody quite understood. Her personnel file read like fiction. Decorated F-16 pilot, instructor at the Air Force Academy, then suddenly requesting transfer to rotary wing operations. The rumor mill suggested everything from a failed romance to post-traumatic stress, but Nakamura never explained, and regulations prevented anyone from asking directly. "What about the weather bird?" someone called out, referring to the lone helicopter equipped with advanced navigation systems designed for extreme conditions. It was an experimental aircraft, a modified Black Hawk that looked more like a science project than a military asset. Sensors and antennas sprouted from every surface, and its cockpit resembled something from a space shuttle rather than a conventional helicopter. "Weather's too severe," Briggs replied automatically. "That storm system extends from ground level to 30,000 feet. Visibility is zero. Even our best pilots couldn't." "Sir," Nakamura's voice was quiet, almost conversational. She stood slowly, her movement drawing every eye in the room. "Permission to volunteer for weather reconnaissance." The silence that followed was complete. Outside, the wind howled across the airfield, carrying the scent of approaching sand and the promise of the storm that had already claimed 8 of America's finest warriors. Briggs stared at her, his expression cycling through surprise, skepticism, and something that might have been hope. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking seconds that those lost SEALs didn't have. Nakamura waited, her dark eyes steady, her hands clasped behind her back. She knew what they were thinking. She'd heard the whispers, seen the sideways glances, the Air Force refugee, the pilot who couldn't hack it in fighters, the woman who'd somehow convinced the Army to let her fly their helicopters despite having no business being there. But they didn't know about the light. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, the operations officer, cleared his throat. "Major Nakamura, that aircraft requires specialized training. The navigation systems alone—" "I've logged 40 hours in type, sir," she interrupted gently. "Qualified on all systems." This was true, though she didn't mention the additional 100 hours she'd spent in simulators, or the fact that she'd helped design some of the very equipment they considered too complex for field operations. Her previous life had included more than just flying fighters. She'd been part of a classified program developing next-generation avionics. Briggs frowned. "When did you get whether bird quals?" 3 months ago, sir. Figured it might come in handy." She didn't mention the real reason, the recurring nightmares about being lost in darkness, unable to find her way home. The weather bird wasn't just a helicopter to her, it was penance, a chance to ensure no one else experienced what she'd endured in the skis over Syria 2 years earlier. The colonel studied her face, searching for something. Bravado, maybe, or fear. He found neither. Nakamura had the expression of someone who'd already made peace with whatever was coming. It was a look he'd seen before, usually on soldiers who'd been to the edge and somehow found their way back. The storm extends beyond our operational ceiling, he said finally. You'd be flying blind into conditions that have already claimed one aircraft and crew. Not blind, sir. Nakamura's response was matter of fact. The weather bird sees what we can't. She was referring to the aircraft's synthetic aperture radar, its forward-looking infrared systems, and the experimental navigation suite that could theoretically punch through electromagnetic interference that defeated conventional GPS. Theoretically. In practice, nobody had tested the systems in conditions this severe. The room remained silent except for the steady hum of air conditioning and the distant rumble of thunder. Sand had begun tapping against the windows like impatient fingers, and the lights flickered as the storm's outer edges reached the base. Time was running out for the missing SEALs, and everyone knew it. In this environment, without shelter, exposure would kill them within hours. Webb spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. Major, with respect, the weather bird is a $60 million prototype. If we lose both the aircraft and you, then you'll have lost a pilot and a machine, Nakamura finished. But those 8 men will still be out there, and their families will still be waiting for answers. She paused, her gaze moving around the room. I didn't transfer to the Army to fly milk runs, sir. The wall-mounted radio crackled. Any station, this is Bravo 7. The voice was weak, distorted by static, but unmistakably human. The room erupted in controlled chaos as communications specialists scrambled to establish contact. We are alive but disoriented. GPS is down. Repeat, GPS is down. Medical emergency. Request immediate extraction. Then silence again. They'd managed one transmission before the storm swallowed them once more. Briggs looked at Nakamura with new intensity. Outside, the sandstorm had arrived in earnest, turning the world beyond the windows into a brown, swirling void. The base's klaxons wailed as all flight operations were suspended. In conditions like these, even walking between buildings became dangerous. Major, he said slowly, if you can find them in this soup, you'll be flying in weather that violates every safety protocol we have. Yes, sir. Her response was immediate, unwavering. And if you go down, we won't be able to mount a rescue until this passes. Understood, sir. Briggs walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The storm pressed against the glass like a living thing, hungry and patient. When he turned back to face the room, his expression had hardened into the mask of command, the look of a man making decisions that would haunt him regardless of their outcome. Get her airborne, he said quietly. God help us all. The hangar bay felt like a cathedral when Nakamura entered, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. The weather bird sat in the center, surrounded by technicians making final preparations. Chief Warrant Officer Tommy Kowalski, her usual co-pilot, was conspicuously absent, grounded by regulations that prohibited him from flying in conditions this severe with his wife expecting their first child. Instead, Captain Elena Vasquez waited by the aircraft, her helmet bag slung over her shoulder. Vasquez was new to the unit, a recent graduate of flight school with exactly 0 combat hours. Her presence was both a blessing and a curse. She was qualified on the systems, but untested under pressure. Ma'am, Vasquez said as Nakamura approached. Weather's reporting sustained winds at 80 knots, gusting to over 100. Visibility less than 10 meters. Are we really doing this? Nakamura studied the younger woman's face. Vasquez was trying to hide her fear, but it showed in the tight line of her mouth, the way her hands gripped her gear a little too firmly. Captain, I need to know right now, are you with me, or do I find another co-pilot? I'm with you, ma'am. The response came without hesitation, though Vasquez's voice carried a slight tremor. Those SEALs have families too. They spent the next 20 minutes conducting a pre-flight inspection that was more ritual than necessity. The aircraft had been maintained to perfection by technicians who knew their work might mean the difference between life and death. The Weatherbird was beautiful in its own way, sleek where conventional helicopters were utilitarian, bristling with sensors that gave it an almost predatory appearance. Nakamura ran her hand along the aircraft's nose, feeling the subtle warmth of electronic systems humming to life. The machine represented everything she'd lost and everything she hoped to regain. In her previous life, she'd flown fighters that moved like extensions of her will, aircraft that responded to thought as much as touch. The Weatherbird was different, heavier, more complex, but it carried the same promise of redemption she'd been seeking since Syria. Major Vasquez was standing by the cockpit waiting. "Let's bring them home," Nakamura replied and climbed aboard. The cockpit was a marvel of modern avionics, displays and controls arranged with the precision of a Swiss watch. Nakamura's hands moved automatically through the startup sequence, muscle memory guiding her through procedures she could perform blindfolded. Around them, the hangar began to empty as non-essential personnel cleared the area. "Tower, this is Weather One, requesting immediate departure." Weather One Tower. Winds are currently 80 knots, gusting to 105. Weather is below minimums for all aircraft operations. Recommend you delay until conditions improve. Nakamura keyed her microphone. "Tower, Weather One, we have men down in Sector 7. Request emergency departure clearance." A pause, then, Weather One cleared for takeoff, runway 09, winds 85 knots at 040 degrees. Good luck. The hangar doors ground open, revealing a wall of brown chaos. Sand and debris whirled through the opening like angry spirits, and the wind's howl became deafening. Vasquez's hand moved instinctively to her harness, checking that she was securely strapped in. Nakamura lifted the collective and felt the Weatherbird respond, its rotors biting into air thick with sand and dust. The aircraft shuddered as it encountered the storm's full force, but its systems held. On her displays, the world reduced itself to green lines and digital readouts, artificial representations of a reality too violent for human eyes to process. "Jesus," Vasquez whispered as they climbed into the maelstrom, "I can't see anything." "You don't need to see," Nakamura replied, her voice steady over the intercom. "The bird sees for us." They rose through layers of turbulence that would have torn a lesser aircraft apart, the Weatherbird's advanced flight control systems making constant corrections to keep them stable. At 2,000 feet, they entered the storm's heart, a world of perpetual twilight where up and down became meaningless concepts. The synthetic aperture radar painted a ghostly picture on Nakamura's primary display, showing the terrain below as a topographical map of green and amber contours. It was beautiful and terrifying, like flying through a computer simulation of hell. "Weather One, this is base. Do you have contact with Bravo 7? "Negative, base. Beginning search pattern now." Nakamura banked the aircraft toward the SEAL's last known position, a grid reference that had become meaningless in the storm's chaos. The GPS was indeed compromised, its signals scattered by electromagnetic interference that made conventional navigation impossible. But the Weatherbird had other ways of seeing. Its inertial navigation system, originally designed for spacecraft, could maintain position accuracy within meters even without satellite guidance. Combined with the radar's terrain mapping capability, it created a three-dimensional picture of the world that existed independent of weather or electromagnetic jamming. Vasquez monitored the communications equipment, hopping to catch another transmission from the stranded team. The radio spectrum was filled with static and false signals generated by the storm itself, an electronic symphony of chaos that made finding real human voices nearly impossible. "There," Nakamura said suddenly, pointing to her display. "Grid 774218, metal signature approximately vehicle-sized." It was their Humvee, abandoned and partially buried by drifting sand. The SEALs had been forced to leave their transportation behind, which meant they were on foot in conditions that could kill within hours. How far could they have traveled? Vasquez asked, studying the terrain map. In this weather, not far. Nakamura began a systematic search pattern, flying slow and low, the weather bird's sensors probing through the sand-filled air like electronic fingers. They'll look for shelter. High ground, maybe a rock formation or... The radio crackled. Any station, this is Bravo 7 actual. We are in a cave system, approximate bearing 270 from our vehicle. One man down with severe heat exhaustion. Request immediate extraction. Nakamura felt her pulse quicken. The transmission was weak, distorted, but it gave her something to work with. She turned the aircraft west, following the bearing the SEAL team leader had provided. The weather bird moved through the storm like a ghost, its passage marked only by the steady beat of rotors and the green glow of instrument displays. Below them, the desert had been transformed into an alien landscape of shifting dunes and sculpted rock formations. It was beautiful and deadly, a reminder of nature's power to humble even the most advanced technology. There, Vasquez said, pointing to her screen. Caves at bearing 268, distance approximately 3 clicks from the vehicle. Nakamura studied the radar return. The caves were real, carved into a rocky outcropping that rose from the desert floor like the spine of some ancient creature. It was exactly the kind of shelter experienced soldiers would seek in a sandstorm. Bravo 7, this is Weather 1. We have your position, preparing for extraction. The response was immediate. Weather 1, Bravo 7 actual, negative on extraction at this location. Caves are unstable and we have insufficient clearing for aircraft approach. Request you guide us to alternate landing zone. Nakamura cursed silently. The SEALs were trapped in shelter they couldn't leave safely, and she couldn't reach them where they were. It was a tactical puzzle that required both skill and creativity to solve. Vasquez, pull up the topographical survey for this area. I need to find flat ground within walking distance of those caves. The captain's fingers flew over her displays, accessing databases that had been loaded before their departure. The weather bird carried detailed maps of every square kilometer of Afghanistan, updated with intelligence reports and reconnaissance photos. Here, Vasquez said, highlighting an area on the shared display. Flat ground, approximately 800 meters southeast of the cave system. It's exposed, but it's the best option within reasonable distance. Nakamura studied the location. It was far from ideal, completely open to the storm's fury, with no natural windbreaks or protection. Landing there would be like setting down in the middle of a hurricane, but it was possible, and possible was all they needed. Bravo 7, Weather 1. I have a landing zone for you, bearing 135 from your current position, distance 800 meters. You'll need to move on foot through the storm. Roger, Weather 1. We can make that distance, but we'll need guidance. Navigation is impossible in these conditions. This was the moment Nakamura had been preparing for without realizing it. Everything she'd learned, every hour in simulators, every nightmare about being lost in darkness, it all led to this. 8 men needed her light to guide them home. She began a slow orbit around the designated landing zone, using the weather bird's powerful searchlight to create a beacon that could penetrate even the storm's fury. The light cut through the sand and dust like a laser, a brilliant white column that could be seen for kilometers. Bravo 7, do you see my light? Affirmative, Weather 1, we see your light, beginning movement to the LZ. The next 30 minutes were the longest of Nakamura's career. She maintained a steady orbit, fighting turbulence that tried to throw the aircraft into the ground, while keeping the searchlight focused on the landing zone. Vasquez monitored their fuel status and systems, calling out warnings when wind shear threatened to exceed the aircraft's limits. On the ground, 8 Navy SEALs struggled through conditions that defied description. The storm had turned the desert into a liquid thing, sand flowing like water, visibility reduced to arm's length. They moved in single file, connected by rope, following the distant glow of Nakamura's light like ancient mariners following a lighthouse. Weather 1 Bravo 7, we're at the LZ, ready for pickup. Nakamura felt her heart rate spike. Landing in these conditions would require every skill she'd ever learned, every instinct she'd developed in 2 decades of flying. The wind was gusting over 100 knots, changing direction without warning. The sand would reduce visibility to zero the moment they descended below 100 feet. Vasquez, talk me down. I need constant updates on height and drift. Roger, ma'am. You're at 200 feet drifting left. Wind is 105 knots from the northeast. Nakamura began her descent, feeling the weather bird fight her every inch of the way. The aircraft bucked and rolled, its advanced flight controls working overtime to maintain stability. Through her forward-looking infrared system, she could see the heat signatures of the seals huddled together on the ground, their body warmth creating ghostly shapes against the cool desert sand. 100 feet drifting right, wind shifting to the east. The searchlight illuminated a cone of swirling sand and debris directly below them. It was like looking into a snow globe being shaken by an angry giant. Nakamura could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cockpit's air conditioning. 50 feet centered on the LZ. Wind is 110 knots, gusting to 125. The weather bird shuddered as it encountered ground effect, the interaction between its rotor wash and the earth creating additional turbulence. Sand scoured the windscreen, turning it opaque. Nakamura was flying entirely on instruments now, trusting her displays more than her eyes. 20 feet still centered, looking good, ma'am. 10 feet contact imminent. The aircraft touched down with a jar that rattled every bolt and rivet. Immediately, the cabin door slid open and the seals began boarding, moving with the practiced efficiency of elite soldiers. Even injured and exhausted, they maintained their discipline. 8 packs aboard, Vasquez reported. Medical case is stable but needs immediate attention. Nakamura didn't wait for confirmation. She pulled power and lifted off, the weather bird rising into the storm like a phoenix emerging from ashes. The wind tried to drive them back down, but the aircraft's engines had power in reserve, and Nakamura had skills that hadn't been tested in 2 years. They climbed through the turbulence, past the worst of the storm, until they broke into relatively clear air at 8,000 feet. Below them, the sandstorm continued its assault on the earth, but up here, stars were visible through breaks in the clouds. Base, this is Weather 1. 8 souls on board, 1 medical emergency. Request immediate medical team at the landing zone. Weather 1 base, outstanding work. Medical team is standing by. In the cabin behind them, Navy SEAL Chief Petty Officer Miguel Santos leaned forward to tap Nakamura on the shoulder. His face was caked with sand and dust, his uniform shredded by hours in the storm, but his eyes were clear and grateful. "Ma'am," he said over the intercom, "I don't know who you are, but you just saved 8 lives. Thank you." Nakamura nodded, not trusting her voice. Through her side window, she could see the lights of Bagram Airfield growing larger, a constellation of civilization in the darkness. The weather bird flew smoothly now, its mission complete, carrying its cargo of rescued warriors toward safety. As they descended toward the runway, Vasquez keyed her microphone. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, why did you transfer from fighters to helicopters?" Nakamura was quiet for a long moment, watching the approach lights grow brighter. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost lost in the engine noise. "Because fighters can't carry people home," she said, "and sometimes that's all that matters." The weather bird touched down gently, its wheels kissing the runway with barely a bump. As the engines wound down and the rotor slowed, ground crews rushed to meet them, medics racing toward the aircraft with stretchers and emergency equipment. But for just a moment, in the sudden quiet of the cockpit, Nakamura allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in 2 years: peace. The nightmares might return, the doubts and second-guessing that had driven her from fighters to helicopters. But tonight, 8 families would not receive visits from casualty notification officers. Tonight, her light had been enough. Chief Santos was the last to leave the aircraft. As he stepped onto the tarmac, he turned back and saluted, not the casual acknowledgement of military courtesy, but the deep, respectful gesture of one warrior honoring another. Nakamura returned the salute, and for the first time since Syria, she felt like she might actually make it home. 3 days later, the sandstorm had passed, leaving behind a desert scoured clean and bright under the Afghan sun. In the operations center, Colonel Briggs stood before a wall map, red pins marking the locations of ongoing missions across the theater. The pin marking Bravo 7's rescue had been moved to the completed section, but its story had already begun spreading through the close-knit community of military aviators. Major Nakamura sat in the same corner where she'd waited 3 days earlier, but something had changed. The other pilots no longer avoided her gaze or spoke in whispers when she entered a room. Word had spread quickly in the way it always did in military units, not through official channels, but through the informal network of respect that connected those who'd proven themselves under fire. "Raven," called Captain Mike Torres, one of the Apache pilots, "you got a minute?" She looked up from the maintenance report she'd been reviewing. Torres was old-school Army aviation, a warrant officer who'd worked his way up through the ranks and had opinions about everything. His calling her by her call sign instead of rank was significant. It meant acceptance. "What's up, Torres?" "My co-pilot's been asking about cross-training on the Weatherbird. Kid thinks it's some kind of magic machine after what you pulled off." Torres grinned, but there was respect in his expression. "Told him the machine's only as good as the pilot. You available to give him some stick time?" Nakamura considered the request. Training other pilots on the Weatherbird systems would mean sharing knowledge she'd guarded closely since her arrival. It would mean explaining capabilities that were still classified, discussing techniques that had taken her months to develop. "Send him over this afternoon," she said finally. "We'll start with the simulators." Torres nodded and walked away, but not before offering something that had been absent from their previous interactions: an easy, professional smile. It was a small thing, but in the military, small gestures often carried enormous weight. Vasquez appeared at Nakamura's elbow, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the slightly stunned expression of someone still processing what they'd experienced. The young captain had performed admirably during the rescue, maintaining her composure and providing critical support when it mattered most. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about what you said, about fighters not being able to carry people home." Vasquez settled into the chair beside her. "Is that really why you transferred?" Nakamura accepted the coffee gratefully, using the pause to consider her answer. The truth was more complicated than her simple explanation, layered with decisions and consequences that had shaped the last 2 years of her life. "Part of it," she said finally. "In fighters, your mission is to project power to dominate airspace to eliminate threats. It's pure and clean and simple. You succeed or you fail, and the metrics are unambiguous." She paused, staring out the window at the flight line where helicopters were preparing for the day's missions. Each aircraft would carry soldiers, supplies, or hope to different corners of Afghanistan, connecting isolated outposts to the larger war effort. "But helicopters," she continued, "helicopters are about connection, about bridging distances, carrying burdens, bringing people together or taking them home. It's messier, more complex, but ultimately more human." Vasquez nodded thoughtfully. "Is that what happened in Syria? You lost someone?" The question hung in the air between them, direct and unavoidable. Nakamura felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the weight of memories she'd spent 2 years trying to escape. But something about the last 3 days, The storm, the rescue, the acceptance she'd seen in Tor's eyes made the burden feel lighter. 8 Special Forces soldiers, she said quietly. Similar situation to the other night, but different outcome. I was flying F-16s then, part of a close air support mission. They were trapped, surrounded, calling for immediate assistance. She took a sip of coffee, using the pause to steady herself. Outside, the morning's first helicopters were lifting off, their rotors beating rhythm against the clear sky. I had the weapons, the training, the authorization. Everything I needed to eliminate the threat and clear a path for extraction helicopters. But the weather was deteriorating, visibility was dropping, and my window was closing fast. Vasquez waited, understanding that this was a story that couldn't be rushed. I made the tactically correct decision, Nakamura continued. Climbed above the weather, maintained situational awareness, preserved my aircraft for future missions. By the book, professionally sound, exactly what any reasonable pilot would have done. But while I was being reasonable and professional, 8 soldiers died waiting for help that never came. The extraction helicopters arrived too late, found only bodies and burned equipment. Nakamura's voice remained steady, but her knuckles were white where they gripped her coffee cup. The after-action report praised my judgment. No pilot error, no equipment failure, no violation of procedures. Just one of those tragic situations where everything goes wrong despite everyone doing their job correctly. She turned to look directly at Vasquez, her dark eyes reflecting depths of pain that had been carefully hidden for 2 years. The problem was, I couldn't accept that answer. Couldn't live with being tactically correct while 8 families received folded flags and empty condolences. So I requested transfer to rotary wing operations, figuring that if I was going to lose people, it wouldn't be because I chose to stay safe and reasonable. The operations center continued its busy hum around them, radios crackling with routine traffic, clerks updating mission boards, pilots planning their daily flights. But in their corner, 2 women sat surrounded by the kind of silence that followed difficult truths. "Ma'am," Vasquez said finally, "what you did 3 nights ago, that wasn't about making up for Syria. That was about being the pilot those SEALs needed, right then in that storm." Nakamura smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness she'd shown since arriving at Bagram 6 months earlier. "Maybe you're right, Captain. Maybe it was about both." The wall-mounted speaker crackled to life. "All helicopter pilots report to Briefing Room 2 for mission assignments. All helicopter pilots to Briefing Room 2. They stood together, gathering their gear for another day of flying in a war that seemed to have no end. But as they walked toward the briefing room, Nakamura felt something she hadn't experienced in months, anticipation rather than dread. The nightmares might return, the weight of Syria might never fully lift, but she'd proven something to herself in that sandstorm. Sometimes being reasonable wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to be willing to fly into the darkness, trusting your light to guide others home. The briefing room was packed with pilots from across the aviation task force. Apache gunship crews, Black Hawk transport pilots, Chinook heavy-lift specialists, and the handful of aviators qualified on specialized aircraft like the Weather Bird. They were a diverse group united by the common bond of military aviation, the brotherhood and sisterhood of those who earned their living in 3 dimensions. Lieutenant Colonel Webb stood at the front of the room, pointer in hand, ready to walk them through the day's missions. Behind him, a large screen display showed the operational area, red zones marking areas of enemy activity, blue symbols indicating friendly positions, and yellow markers highlighting today's objectives. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb began, "we have a full slate today. 3 resupply missions to forward operating bases, 2 medical evacuations, 1 VIP transport, and a reconnaissance flight along the Pakistani border." He proceeded to assign missions to crews, matching aircraft capabilities with mission requirements. The Apache crews drew the reconnaissance mission, their heavily armed aircraft ideal for operating in contested airspace. The Black Hawks received the medical evacuations and VIP transport, their versatility making them perfect for diverse mission sets. Weather Bird crew, Webb said, looking directly at Nakamura, you're on standby. After your performance 3 nights ago, higher headquarters wants you available for emergency response. It was both recognition and burden. Being designated as the emergency response asset meant they were trusted with the most difficult missions, but it also meant sitting and waiting while others flew routine sorties. For a pilot, waiting was often harder than flying. "Sir," Nakamura said, raising her hand, "request permission to conduct training flights during standby periods. Captain Vasquez and I could use the time to refine our procedures." Webb considered the request. Training flights meant more flying hours, higher costs, and increased wear on an expensive aircraft. But they also meant better preparation for the next emergency, whenever it might come. "Approved," he said finally, "but stay within 30 minutes of base. If we need you fast." The briefing concluded with weather updates, intelligence summaries, and safety reminders. As pilots filed out to begin their pre-flight preparations, several approached Nakamura with questions about the Weather Bird's capabilities. Word of the Sandstorm rescue had elevated the previously mysterious aircraft to legendary status among the aviation community. Chief Warrant Officer Rebecca Hayes, one of the most experienced Black Hawk pilots in the unit, stopped beside Nakamura as they left the briefing room. "Raven," she said, using the call sign that was becoming Nakamura's accepted identifier, "I've been flying helicopters for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you pulled off the other night. How do you maintain control in those conditions?" Nakamura appreciated the question because it focused on technique rather than heroics. Hayes was asking as one professional to another, seeking knowledge that might save lives in future emergencies. "The key is trusting your instruments completely," Nakamura replied. "In severe weather, your eyes become liabilities. The Weather Bird systems can see through conditions that would blind conventional aircraft, but only if you're willing to ignore what your senses are telling you. That goes against everything we're taught about maintaining visual references." "True," Nakamura acknowledged, "but there are situations where conventional wisdom becomes dangerous. The trick is knowing when to break the rules and having the training to do it safely." They walked together toward the flight line, where ground crews were preparing aircraft for the day's missions. The Afghan sun was already intense despite the early hour, and heat shimmer was beginning to rise from the concrete ramp. "You know," Hayes said, "there's been talk about setting up a specialized weather operations course, teaching more pilots to handle extreme conditions. Would you be interested in helping develop the curriculum?" Nakamura stopped walking, surprised by the suggestion. Teaching had always been part of her career plans, but she'd assumed those opportunities were lost when she left fighters for helicopters. The idea of passing on hard-won knowledge to other pilots appealed to her sense of purpose. "I'd be honored," she said. "When do we start?" "I'll talk to the colonel. We could probably get approval to run a pilot program here, use real-world conditions as a training laboratory." Hayes grinned. "Afghanistan's got plenty of weather to practice in." They reached the Weather Bird's hangar, where Vasquez was already conducting the pre-flight inspection. The aircraft gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its sensors and antennas catching the illumination like electronic jewelry. Ground crew members moved around it with the careful attention of technicians who understood they were maintaining something special. Sergeant First Class David Kim, the Weather Bird's crew chief, approached with a clipboard full of maintenance forms. Kim was a perfectionist who treated the aircraft like a living thing, monitoring every system, tracking every component, ensuring that mechanical failure would never compromise a mission. "Morning, Major," he said, offering the clipboard. "All systems green, fuel topped off, and I've run diagnostics on the navigation suite. Everything checks out perfect." Nakamura reviewed the forms, noting Kim's meticulous attention to detail. Every entry was complete, every signature properly placed, every inspection item verified. It was the kind of professional excellence that made complex operations possible. "Thanks, Sergeant. Any word on the radar upgrade package?" "Should arrive next week," Kim replied. "New synthetic aperture unit with improved resolution and better penetration through atmospheric interference. It'll make what you did the other night look easy. Let's hope we don't need to test it under similar conditions." Kim smiled. "Ma'am, in this business, it's not a matter of if it's when, but when the time comes, this bird will be ready." Nakamura and Vasquez completed their pre-flight procedures and lifted off for a training flight that would keep them within quick response distance of Bagram. As they climbed into the clear morning sky, Nakamura felt the familiar satisfaction of being airborne, of existing in the three-dimensional world where she'd always felt most comfortable. They practiced emergency procedures, navigation techniques, and the complex coordination required to operate the weather bird's sophisticated systems. Vasquez was proving to be an excellent co-pilot,